Okay, so another type of learning that we do is through observation. So far with classical conditioning and operant conditioning, I was mostly talking about like you do something and then you get some sort of outcome from that, and that's going to change your behavior. But we can also learn from just watching other people and what they do and what outcomes do they receive. So in observational learning, basically the observer mimics the behavior of a model. And again, this applies with lots of different things: parenting, teaching, coaching, etc. And there are a few different mechanisms that allow this observational learning to happen. Part of it is through what's called vicarious reinforcement and vicarious punishment. So if I'm a little kid and I see, like, okay, my friend on the playground is bullying this other kid, and now the teacher comes out and gives them a punishment, then I can see that vicariously, like, okay, if I were to do the same behavior, then I would probably also be punished, so I should avoid doing that behavior. So it's very similar to the concepts of classical and operant conditioning. It's just that you're seeing it happen to other people and then learning that would probably apply to me as well if I did the same behavior. So the observer learns through these concepts of vicarious reinforcement and vicarious punishment. There are actually very specific parts of the brain that have neurons called mirror neurons that are really important for this process of observational learning. So a mirror neuron is a neuron that will fire whenever I do a particular behavior, but also when I see someone else do that behavior. So like if I'm writing, then there are certain neurons that will be firing as I'm writing. But if I'm watching you write, then if that neuron is a mirror neuron, it will also fire just as I'm seeing, another person writing. So these neurons, again, very important for this process of learning through observation. They basically help strengthen those neural pathways so that the behavior, is easier to learn once we try to do it ourselves. And kind of interestingly, these neurons are often, they're like not as well developed in people who have like autism and Asperger's, for example. So that's one of the theories of what leads to some of the social difficulties that people with autism have, is that they don't have those mirror neurons that allow them to kind of observe other people's behavior and learn through those observations. Okay. And last thing I wanted to talk about in the context of learning, again, is metacognition. So metacognition is this idea of learning about learning. So basically everything we've been doing today is metacognition to some extent. You're learning about learning, you're thinking about thinking. And there are all kinds of metacognitive skills that people can develop that, again, will help with that learning process, that'll make people more successful and more effective whenever they're trying to learn new information. And really kind of, again, there's a ton of stuff I could talk about here, but the main thing I wanted to talk about, because I think it's most relevant to you as students, is this idea that most people tend to be overconfident in their learning until they have something that shows them, like a test or something comes up, and then they realize, like, wow, I didn't learn as much as I thought I did. And again, this doesn't happen just in classroom settings, but I think it's relevant because we're in a classroom setting. So by overconfidence, basically what I mean is that most people think that they are acquiring information more successfully than they are. So if I asked all of you right now, like, how confident are you? Probably the best way to do it would be to tell you, like, okay, if I gave you an exam right now over all the material that we've covered, what score do you think you would get on that exam? And probably a lot of you would overestimate. You would think that you're going to get a higher score than you actually would on that test. And this is true for a lot of people. So, if you've ever done this, if you think like, oh, I'm going to crush this test, and then you go and take it and you don't do so well, just know, like, you're not alone. A lot of people make this kind of mistake of being overconfident in their learning. And there's a couple things that can exacerbate that overconfidence. One is if you're given sort of partial knowledge. This is kind of counterintuitive, but like the more knowledge you get, the more overconfident you can be. And there's a couple different studies that have showed this in sort of some interesting ways. So there was one, for example, where some clinical psychologists, so these are people who have like a PhD in psychology and they've gotten a license to practice. These clinical psychologists are given this case study about a patient, and it's like an 8-page case study, but they're given it basically like 1 page at a time. So they get page 1, they read it, and then they get a test over that material. And they're first asked, though, like, how confident are you in your knowledge of this material? Like, how much do you think you would get correct? Then they get the test over page 1. Then they get page 2, and they do kind of the same thing. Now they're going to get asked their confidence, how well do you think you know this material? But they're also going to get a test over pages 1 and 2. And then they keep going until they get to the end of the 8 pages, okay? What they find is that people's confidence throughout that keeps going up. So after page 1, their confidence is kind of low, but after page 2, it's higher. After page 3, it's even higher. By the time they get to page 8, their confidence is like really, really high. But their performance on the test stays flat. They don't get better, at the test basically as time goes on or as they get more information, but their confidence keeps going up. So something about that process of getting more knowledge makes us think like, oh my gosh, I know everything now, when in reality, that might not necessarily be the case. There was another study they did where they took professional mathematicians and professional historians, and they gave them this test where they would put like a profession and a name, and they would ask them, does this match? So they would say like mathematician and then a name of someone who either is a mathematician or not. And most of the names they gave them were like made up. They're completely made up names. What they found is that the mathematicians said yes to recognizing way more mathematicians that were made up, and the historians said yes to recognizing way more historians that were made up, but not the other way around, right? Like the historians didn't say yes to a bunch of mathematicians, the mathematicians didn't say yes to a bunch of historians. So basically, having that degree in mathematics or history made them think that they knew a lot more than they actually did. So it's kind of difficult, like having this knowledge, I'm not ever sure like what to do with it because I'm kind of in that position, right? Like I have a PhD in psychology and I sometimes wonder like, am I overconfident in my knowledge? Do I think I know more than I do? Probably, because the data would say that's true of most people. There's no reason for me to think that I'm like special or different. But then it's like, well, what do I do with that information? I don't really know. I would say the best thing you can do with that information is just be aware of it and know that just because you think you know something doesn't mean you actually do. And you should kind of always be open to learning new information and always be open to the idea that you might be wrong and that you can be corrected, basically. Another thing that increases this overconfidence, which again, I don't necessarily know what to do with, is whenever content is really easy to process, then we tend to be overconfident in our knowledge of it. So there was a study, I didn't put it in my notes, so I'm going to try to remember the details here. There was a study where basically the researcher were trying to teach people about some topic. I think they were trying to teach about like why calico cats are often male, I think. I might have that backwards. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Are they male or female?
It's mostly female.
Mostly female. Okay, so there was this whole video explaining like why calico cats are mostly female. And in one version of the video, the teacher is like talking very fluently. They're not relying on notes or anything. They're like very confident. Their speech is, rhythmic and everything. They're very engaging. And then in another video, it's the exact same content. They're saying the exact same words, but they're kind of like stuttering and they're like fiddling with their notes and they kind of whisper sometimes. So one of the videos, really easy to process. The other one, not very easy to process. So, participants watch one of those two videos and then they're asked, how confident are you in your knowledge of this information? Or if I gave you a test, what score do you think you would get? Okay. What they found is the ones who watched the really fluent video, they were really, really confident. The ones who watched the less fluent video, their confidence was less, but they both did equally well on the actual test. So something about just the material being really fluid and easy to process made people more confident. So again, as an instructor, I kind of struggle with this. Like I come into class sometimes and like obviously I want to be engaging, I want to be fluent and all of that, but it's like, am I making you overconfident by doing that? Because I often have students who, again, like in class, when I'm talking about something, it seems like it's clicking, it seems like it makes sense to you, but then you test time, it's like, no, actually, you didn't retain that information or whatever. So again, as students, I would just encourage you to use the tools that I'll be talking about in a little bit to actually test yourself so that you're not relying on that confidence. Another thing I would say maybe to take away from all this is that confidence is not a good indicator of learning or of memory. So being confident that like, oh, I definitely remember this thing happened, or I remember this piece of information, that confidence is useless. You should not rely on that as an indicator of the accuracy of something. But we all do, right? We all think like, oh, if I'm confident that I know this, or if another person sounds confident that they know it, then they probably do. That's not true at all. Confidence is not a good indicator of pretty much anything other than like self-esteem, basically. Okay, so some of the things you can do to decrease your overconfidence, first of all, just having better knowledge of memory and learning and how they work can decrease that overconfidence. So me giving you all of this information right now should help. But one of the main things is just testing your own knowledge. So the reason I give you quizzes every week and kind of structure it the way I do, where I'm looking at it more as like you are testing yourself rather than me testing you, is because I want you to know, like, do you really know this information, or do you just think you do because it sounds easy in the moment whenever I'm saying it? So testing yourself is, really good way to humble yourself, I guess, basically, is kind of the way to say it. Okay, any questions about metacognition or learning in general? Okay.